Hello and welcome to Indus News live from Islamabad. I am Muneeb Hamid with the news of this hour. Let's begin with the headlines first. Pakistan has summoned a senior Indian diplomat to lodge its strong protest over the latest ceasefire violations along the line of control. The Foreign Office says an 11-year-old girl was martyred and 4 other civilians wounded in unprovoked Indian firing. Earlier, the Pakistan's military's media wing said Indian forces targeted civilian population with heavy mortars in Hot Spring and Rakchikri sectors, which was responded effectively. Afghanistan's High Council for National Reconciliation Chief Abdullah says representatives of the Taliban and the Afghan government will discuss ways to implement a permanent ceasefire today. Meanwhile, after meeting Taliban's political deputy leader Mullah Baradar Akhund, United States Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said the group must seize the opportunity of intra-Afghan talks to forge a political settlement and reach a comprehensive ceasefire to end 40 years of war. Mullah Akhund also discussed Afghan peace with Pakistan's Ambassador Mohammad Sadiq Khan. China has slammed a U.S. report accusing Beijing of expansionist military ambitions. In a statement, China's Defense Ministry spokesperson said Washington itself poses the biggest threat to global peace. He called the U.S. Defense Department's report a malicious distortion of facts. News in detail coming up after a short break. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Now let's have the news in detail. Pakistan has summoned a senior Indian diplomat to lodge a strong protest over the latest ceasefire violations along the line of control. In a statement, the Foreign Office said an 11-year-old girl was martyred and 4 other civilians wounded in unprovoked Indian firing. Spokesperson HOUTHIS Chaudhry said the Indian troops are continuously targeting civilian population with heavy weaponry. Chaudhry said 18 civilians have been martyred and 176 were wounded in 2,225 ceasefire violations so far this year. He said New Delhi's senseless acts of aggression are in clear violation of the 2003 ceasefire understanding. Islamabad also urged New Delhi to allow the UN military observers to play their mandated role as per the Security Council resolutions. Earlier, the Pakistan military's media wing said Indian forces targeted civilian population with heavy mortars in Hot Spring and Rakchikri sectors, which was responded effectively. Afghanistan's High Council for National Reconciliation Chief Abdullah says the Taliban and Kabul's negotiators will discuss ways to implement a permanent ceasefire as priority when they meet today. In an interview, Abdullah said representatives will decide on priority issues, starting with those on which it is easiest to find common ground. He also emphasized the government team will focus on protecting women's rights. Meanwhile, after meeting Taliban's political deputy leader Mullah Baradar Akhund, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said the group must seize the opportunity of intra-Afghan talks to forge a political settlement and reach a comprehensive ceasefire to end 40 years of war. Mullah Akhund also discussed Afghan peace with Pakistan's Ambassador Mohammad Sadiq Khan. Earlier, the Taliban said they have released 22 Afghan soldiers in the southern Helmand province as a goodwill gesture. Meanwhile, Prime Minister Pakistan's Special Representative for Afghanistan Mohammad Sadiq Khan has met with all stakeholders at the intra-Afghan negotiations in Doha. Sadiq says he had significantly useful discussions with the negotiators. Mohammad Sadiq met Chairman of Afghanistan's High Council for National Reconciliation, Abdullah. He also called on Kabul's chief negotiator to intra-Afghan negotiations, Mohammad Masoom Staniksai. The Prime Minister's representative also held a discussion with Mullah Abdul Ghani Baradar and other members of the Taliban Political Commission. Taliban spokesperson Mohammad Naeem said the two sides discussed relevant issues in detail. Moving on, Iran says the continued presence of foreign forces in Afghanistan is the main reason behind the conflict in the country. In a statement, Iranian Ministry of Foreign Ministry said the Afghanistan conflict has no military solution and dialogue is the only way to find a settlement. The statement said peace and stability in Afghanistan requires the responsible withdrawal of foreign forces. It said Iran hopes that the Afghan government and the Taliban will be able to preserve the democratic and constitutional values of the country. It added Iran welcomes the intra-Afghan talks in Doha and hopes that they will lead to the permanent stability in Afghanistan and in the region. Now, China has slammed a U.S. report accusing Beijing of expansionist military ambitions. In a statement, China's Defense Ministry spokesperson said Washington itself poses the biggest threat to global peace. The spokesperson called the U.S. Defense Department's report a malicious distortion of facts. It said for decades, Washington has violated international order, stirred regional conflicts and destroyed world peace. Beijing urged Washington to take concrete actions to safeguard the healthy development of bilateral military relations. This comes after Pentagon's report said China aims to use its military to revise aspects of international order. Meanwhile, the Saudi-led coalition fighting in Yemen says it has attacked Houthi positions in the capital Sana'a. Saudi state media said fighter jets targeted barracks and military sites of the rebels. The state media said the coalition downed 4 explosive-laden Houthi drones at the Al-Delmi airbase north of Sana'a. A day earlier, the coalition launched 9 strikes on a military engineering camp and headquarters for Houthis. The number of such incidents has spiked after Saudi forces shot down multiple Houthi drones aiming at Riyadh last week. Meanwhile, Mali's new military leaders have agreed to establish an 18-month transition government until an election can take place. The announcement comes after 3 days of talks between military, political leaders and civil society groups. Spokesperson Musa Kamara said the interim government will either be led by a military officer or a civilian. While military junta head Colonel Assimi Goita said they are committed to implementing all resolutions of the charter, including general elections. The opposition coalition has strongly rejected the idea of a military officer leading the transitory period. The US says Libya's renegade commander Khalifa Haftar has committed to ending a months-long blockade of oil facilities. Libya's oil production has plunged by around 3/4 since Haftar launched a blockade. In a statement, the U.S. Embassy in Libya said Haftar's forces had convened their commitment to allow the full reopening of the energy sector. Last week, the National Oil Corporation said total losses due to the blockade in the past 234 days have neared $9.5 billion. The blockade has also cut off revenue for state institutions operating across the country. The Lebanese army has clashed with the anti-government protesters as they marched towards the presidential palace in Baghdad city. The protesters chanted slogans against President Michel Aoun for his failure to control economic and political crisis. Soldiers fired rubber bullets at the demonstrators and live rounds in the air to disperse hundreds of protesters. Supporters of President Aoun called for a counter-protest at the same location, adding to the tension. The demonstrations have intensified after the massive explosion shattered Beirut, killing 200 people. Now, moving on to Israel, where thousands of people have staged a protest outside Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's residence in Jerusalem for the 12th consecutive week. They are calling for Netanyahu's resignation over allegations of corruption and his mishandling of the coronavirus pandemic. Police have made a few arrests, though protesters have been peaceful.
I think it's time for Bibi to go away and leave us alone, and not alone, I mean without him, and let him figure out what to do with all these accusations he's got against him.
The Prime Minister was indicted on charges of bribery, fraud and breach of trust in November last year. Now, moving on, the US says it will continue to support the Sudanese people as flash floods continue to ravage the country. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said he called Sudan's Premier Abdallah Hamdok to offer condolences for those who died in the floods. Pompeo said the two sides discussed US assistance for flood response. Over 100 people have died in floods that swamped more than 100,000 houses. Since July, 500 people had been injured due to the flooding. On Thursday, authorities declared an economic emergency following a dramatic plunge in the value of national currency. Now, 9 people have died after a landslide triggered by overnight rainfall swept through 3 Nepalese villages. Rescue officials say 22 people missing are believed to be still buried under the debris. The officials said they pulled out the bodies from underneath the houses in eastern Sindhupalchok district with the help of the locals. Landslides are common in mountainous Nepal during the monsoon season that usually ends in September. The government data shows the number of rain-related deaths this year has reached 351, with 85 people missing. In India, the number of coronavirus cases has topped 4.7 million, with over 94,000 infections overnight. The country has registered 1,114 deaths in the past 24 hours, taking the toll to over 78,500. France has reported a record high number of single-day COVID-19 cases, as more than 10,500 people tested positive. Globally, the virus has claimed over 920,000 lives and infected more than 28.7 million people so far. More details in this report.
Second wave of COVID-19 has started eroding all progress made by European countries in containing the virus in major countries like France, UK, Germany, Spain and Italy. In the US, the virus continues its aggressive spread in most of the states as President Donald Trump opposes restrictions. Down south, Latin American states are being devastated by the disease, where Brazil, Mexico and Colombia top the list.
Many families have lost loved ones. We have seen the economic and social devastation across the planet and also in our own territory. We had never thought about living through a situation like this, but we have seen in these months that as a country we have resilience, motivation and enthusiasm to move forward.
In a positive development, AstraZeneca has resumed British clinical trials of its COVID-19 vaccine after getting a green light from the safety watchdogs. Meanwhile, Australia has decided to extend restrictions on its COVID-19 hotspot state of Victoria.
Today, I can announce that we have extended the state of emergency and the state of disaster for a further 4 weeks. That underpins all the different rules. It underpins taking those safe and steady steps.
Decide today if it would extend stricter antivirus curbs in the greater Seoul area as number of infections drop. But in Wuhan, the place where it all started, domestic air travel has returned to pre-pandemic levels with 500 domestic flights.
Meanwhile, in Pakistan, 6 people have died from COVID-19 in the last 24 hours. The Health Ministry says the country's death toll has reached 6,379. The ministry said 526 people tested positive for the virus overnight. It said there are 5,673 active infections, while the total confirmed cases have crossed 301,000. The ministry said over 289,000 people have recovered so far. Earlier, Federal Minister for Planning and Development Asad Umar said Pakistan will begin phase 3 trial of a Chinese vaccine in 10 days. Now, the United Nations has stepped up efforts to combat COVID-19 among Syrian refugees in Jordanian camps after cluster outbreaks. UN High Commissioner for Refugees Representatives in Jordan, Dominic Barch, said 5 cases were reported in Zaatari camps and Azra camps this week. Barch said the latest developments have been a worrying situation for all, especially for the refugees. He said crowded spaces and cramped living conditions in these camps make social distancing extremely difficult. The agency said the patients' families have also been quarantined inside the camp. The infections in these camps that house around 120,000 Syrian refugees are the first since the cases were reported in the kingdom in March. More news coming up in this bulletin after a short break. Stay tuned. Welcome back now. Moving on with the news stories. United Nations Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has urged the European Union members to take in migrants stranded in Greece. The Moria camp on Lesbos Island that hosted almost 12,000 refugees burned to ground earlier this week. In an interview, Guterres said the only solution to the migrant crisis in Moria camp is transferring them to multiple states. He said thousands of hopeless and destitute asylum seekers cannot be accommodated by Greece alone. The UN chief said the destruction of the camp is an immense tragedy as the refugees are now living in the open air in miserable conditions. Guterres welcomed 10 EU states' initiative to take in a total of 400 unaccompanied minors from Lesbos, but said much more needed to be done. Earlier, police fired tear gas shells at refugees protesting for shelter. The US has expressed deep concern over Turkey's actions, calling for a diplomatic solution to the Eastern Mediterranean crisis. During a visit to Cyprus, US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said countries in the region should look forward to negotiations to resolve the bilateral issues. The US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo announced plans to further security cooperation between Washington and Nicosia. Pompeo said the disagreements over regional security and maritime energy resources should be peacefully resolved. The top US diplomat said Nicosia has the right to exploit the natural resources in its territorial sea and its exclusive economic zone.
We remain deeply concerned by Turkey's ongoing operations surveying for natural resources in areas over which Greece and Cyprus assert jurisdiction in the Eastern Mediterranean. The Republic of Cyprus has the right to exploit its natural resources, including the right to hydrocarbons found in its territorial sea and its exclusive economic zone. We also believe that the resources of Cyprus should be shared equitably among the Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots community.
Meanwhile, Greece has ramped up its defense spending amid tensions with neighboring Turkey over energy resources in the Eastern Mediterranean. In an address, Greek Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis said Athens will strengthen its armed forces after years of de-investment. Mr. Takis said it is time to balance the country's economic and security objectives. He said Greece will purchase 18 Rafale fighter jets, 4 new frigates and new weapons including torpedoes and missiles. The armed forces are also set to hire 15,000 personnel over the next 5 years. Mitsotakis said the Greeks are ready to pay the price to keep their place on the world map. Now, in Belarus, police have detained dozens of protesters in Minsk who are demanding the release of jailed opposition leader Maria Kolesnikova. She has emerged as a key opposition figure after others were either jailed or forced out of the country. Protesters say the August 9th elections was rigged to hand Alexander Lukashenko a landslide victory. At least 5,000 protesters, many of them women, gathered in the central Minsk chanting "Go away" in reference to Lukashenko. Last week, Kolesnikova was driven to the Ukrainian border after being seen snatched off the streets of Minsk and into a van by masked men. She is now detained in Minsk and faces a potentially long prison term over accusations of trying to seize power illegally. Peru's ruling coalition has accused the opposition of trying to involve the military as President Martin Vizcarra faces impeachment. Prime Minister Walter Mato says the government will use all legal means to stop the impeachment process. Justice Minister Ana Neira said the bid to oust Vizcarra is affecting the ability of the executive branch to operate properly. Meanwhile, Congress leader Manuel Merino acknowledged he had contacted commanders but denied seeking military support for impeachment.
The call with Admiral Cedron was in the afternoon, when there was still no decision. I cannot be talking about impeachment when there was no motion yet submitted. My call was in the afternoon when we were in a spokesperson meeting when there was a crisis.